a quarter-inch connector to an XLR connector. We make lots of miscellaneous products you might not know about, lots of patch panels. This NYS-SPP-L1 that you see here is probably the most popular prosumer patch panel in the world. We make rack panels, we make goosenecks, we make transformers. We've always made a lot more than connectors, and we make a lot of active devices as well. So we have our Xerium Pro wireless audio, which is a low latency, zero compression audio system. If you're in the broadcast industry, you may know about our Opticam switch, which switches cameras to CCUs. You can put that under automation control. Power monitors for fiber optics. If you've got some older test equipment, it might be called Neutrik test equipment. This division of ours was so popular, we spun it off 20 years ago into what's now called NTI. So making devices has always been very much in the core of what Neutrik does, along with connectors as well. But today we're going to talk about our Dante devices, and this comes down to what we show here is the main actors, the two Dante boxes that have very different feature sets, and what we call our supporting actors, some mounting options for these, and also very importantly this rugged PoE power supply, which we'll talk about quite a bit. So as we begin to look at these boxes, I want to talk about four sort of unique selling points for these. Obviously, there are a lot of Dante boxes on the market. Neutrik did not want to make Me Too boxes. We're not going to, because the people that are making the boxes currently are already our Neutrik clients. So we reviewed what the landscape was, what people were looking for, what wasn't really available so much, and that's what drove our decision to make these devices ourselves. So four of these unique selling points to consider before we get into more detail are, first, that we've got rugged connectors on there, not just XLRs, but also rugged EtherCon connectors, right? So that's something that's missing on some other devices, to have that rugged EtherCon connector. And then for our PoE supply, our power over Ethernet supply, we've got a PowerCon True One TOP connector there. So all the connectors are rugged, they're all locking. This makes them valuable for stage use, for portable AV use, et cetera. So that's one of these unique factors, is the rugged connectors everywhere. Another is this uniquely rugged form factor we have. So these are some images I took from one of our videos, which shows somebody dropping the box. And with this removable rubber cover here, it's fine to take this sort of, let's say, light abuse. I mean, obviously, you never want to torture any device, but this really is terrific for carrying around, deploying, not having to worry too much about not having to be too finicky with the device. Another one is we've got lots and lots of helpful status lights, and we're going to be talking significantly about what all these different lights are and what their value is. When you're deploying a Dante network and you've got these devices out in the field and you're far away from the switches or any other kind of monitor control, it's nice to be able to look directly at the box and say, well, okay, it's, yes, this is on, or no, that's not on, or it's operating in this mode or that mode, and that's what all these lights are for. These lights are not on here on the power supply, but on both the front and the back side of the power supply, there's a little power LED, so you can see that it's on, which is crucial, of course, for the power over Ethernet device. And finally, multiple mounting and deployment options. So we talked about the rubber cover, but you can put brackets on and mount these things under a table or on a lectern, on a podium. You can rack mount the devices. You can truss mount the devices as well. So we'll look at all these in more detail as well. But I just wanted to start with this idea of there are some really unique factors for these boxes that will certainly be helpful under the right circumstances. Okay, well, we can't talk about Dante boxes without talking about Dante a little bit. This is not a Dante webinar per se, it's a Neutrik webinar, but I want to be sure that you do understand some of the basics of Dante. So what does Dante stand for? Dante stands for Digital Audio Network, or Networking Through Ethernet. Dante, D-A-N-T-E. Nice name. I think we can all agree Dante has really become the de facto standard in the industry. There are other standards that are used, like AVB, AES-50. There are other good networks out there, but Dante has become the dominant standard, or at least for the moment, it's the dominant standard. It was developed by and is sold and maintained by a company called Audinate, which is out of Australia, and Audinate's U.S. headquarters is in Oregon. And here are their logos. Audinate very closely controls Dante. The chipsets in all Dante devices are solely manufactured and provided by Audinate. Audinate makes its money from selling these chipsets to manufacturers like Neutrik. And they've got lots and lots of different modules and chips, et cetera. And so a company like Neutrik or anybody else making Dante devices is going to purchase these from Audinate and incorporate them. And here's just kind of a list of what's available at the moment from Audinate. And you'll see these different chips: the Dante Ultimo chip, adapter modules, the Broadway chip, the Brooklyn 2 chip. As you go up, for the most part in this list, you have more and more power in the different chips. And these chips have certain limitations which will come into play here as we work with them. So the Ultimo chip is a fairly new chip
Fred,
from, yes.
I do have a question, so sorry to interrupt, but
No problem.
we had a question from the audience. They are asking, are the PoE injector PoE plus or plus plus?
Give it some time and I will give you a good, thorough answer to that.
All right, perfect.
Yeah. But it's a great question for sure. We'll spend a lot of time looking at those PoE adapters. The Ultimo chip, like I was saying, is a fairly new chip. And when you see all these small little devices that are out now, which are 1 or 2 in, 1 or 2 out, or 2 in, 2 out, those typically are based on the Ultimo chip, which is it's a low-cost chip that allows people to get into Dante at a lower cost. Okay, so how do you create a network using Dante? Well, you need some basics. You need a switch. You need some devices which connect to that switch, and then you need a computer that's running the Dante controller software, which allows you to route these different devices through the switch. You route them, and then you can remove the computer because those routings stay in firmware in the devices. They're remembered within the devices. But these are the basics for creating a Dante network. Audinate offers great training for Dante. This is some screenshots from their website. If you are interested in Dante, I certainly encourage you to go to the Audinate website and take a look and see what they have to offer. So as we're talking about, the basics of a Dante system on a network are a device connected over a cable to a switch, and then again a computer running the software in order to make that configuration. So this is sort of the most basic Dante system you can have. The advantage is because of these switches, you can begin to add more and more devices, and you can make networks which will travel as far as your Ethernet network is traveling. And these are just basic switches. There's no need for anything special in these switches. You can easily expand a Dante network. So here's kind of a silly example with a lot of copying and pasting, but you can add more switches connected to one another, more devices, and you can create extremely elaborate systems. For integrators, for people doing corporate AV, it's wonderful because it simply means that you can jack into your network anywhere with a Dante device, and it will be recognized, and it can then be routed using this Dante controller software. Once you've got everything set up, you can remove the computer. So you see here's the space where the computer had been. You only use that for routing and setting up. Okay, of course, you can also use EtherCon for these networks. EtherCon, which Neutrik developed, a rugged connection so that these cables won't accidentally kick out or accidentally dislodge. Much more rugged, much more reliable. We have it on our devices, and there are switches which have EtherCon on them as well. So for stage use, for rugged use, for situations where it's mission critical, certainly EtherCon is always preferable to standard RJ45s, but you can use either one because EtherCon accepts a standard RJ45 connection as well. So let's just talk a little bit about the pros and cons of digital audio networks. If we talk about the pros compared to a traditional analog network, these digital networks are much more easily configurable. They run over very inexpensive network switches, very inexpensive category cabling. This stuff is much less expensive, much more lightweight than a big old snake. And when you've got a big old snake, you're really limited by the physical length and connectors on that snake. That is no longer the case with a digital network. You can easily add a digital network to existing computer networks, and you can much more easily multiply that out to multiple destinations. So these are, I think we'd all agree, really, the major pros. If we look at the major cons, well, there's some latency. This is just the nature of digital systems. All analog systems have no latency, but I think it's getting harder and harder to find a truly all analog system these days. They require some IT knowledge to set up, and so you've got to be a bit of a computer user. They're not as straightforward. They're not as easily to troubleshoot. So you got to get yourself familiar with switches, which is no big deal. You've got to get yourself familiar with different applications, including these applications from Audinate. And it'll probably be a moment or two where you look like this poor woman. I certainly have looked like this poor woman in the past as I've been trying to figure out what's going on with my configuration. These are the downsides with any digital network, not necessarily Dante, but anytime you start using computer audio compared to the more traditional ways of routing audio. So, okay, let's take a look at Neutrik's Dante solutions. The first one we're going to look at is this NA2-IO-D line, Neutrik adapter 2-channel, input-output, Dante line level. These part numbers make sense. Um, so this particular device, well, both of them we call a ramp on and ramp off device for Dante networks. So again, we consider it an adapter. So on one side of the adapter, you've got uh, analog equipment, and then you're able to adapt that analog equipment into the Dante network here. This is line level, so you're going to plug in a fixed line level source like the output of a mixing board, output of a media player, et cetera, and you're going to get out a fixed level as well. So you will need to have your amplifiers and attenuators for your outputs, and your amplifiers and attenuators for inputs as well. It is a 2-in, 2-out box simultaneously. It can be, any of these connections can be used, any or all of them at the same time. Lockable XLR, lockable EtherCon, powered over PoE. You see that there's no DC power input or anything on this box. It requires PoE, power over Ethernet. Rugged housing with rubber protection, compatible with all Neutrik's different mounting options. And as we talked about, it uses Audinate's Ultimo chip, which has a latency of 1.0 milliseconds. So let's talk a little bit about that Ultimo chip. Low cost design, 1 millisecond minimum latency. Inputs cannot be routed to outputs on the same device. And this is important when you're considering how you're going to use this device in a network environment. If you wanted to send audio in and take it out, well, you need to have two different boxes if you're using this particular one. If you're using any device that's built around the Ultimo chip from Audinate. Typically not an issue because typically you've got different sources going in and coming out, but it's something to be aware of. And then, as I said, all these great LEDs. So the network status LEDs are right here for Link and Active, which are typical network status LEDs. The system LED tells you the system is starting already. The sync LED gives you all sorts of great information about how the device is synchronized to the network. And with Dante Controller, you can send out a message to identify a device, and then these LEDs will flash green. So again, great for remote diagnostics. The NA2-IO-D Pro, again, Neutrik adapter 2-channel input and output, professional. Okay, it's got a lot more features, and so we're going to spend a lot more time talking about this device. You can see here lots of lights, lots of different things going on, lots of labeling as well. So, okay, once again, ramp on, ramp off device, but you've got multiple analog and digital formats with switchable XLRs for analog or AES EBU operation. We're going to talk about this quite a bit. So take a look at this legending here if you can. Channel 1, ANA, analog. Channel 2, analog or AES EBU. Same on the outputs. Channel 1 is analog. Channel 2, analog or AES. Also PoE powered. Primary and secondary Dante ports. So that's why we need to use the back of this device in order to get both of these ports on here. And that's a very powerful feature as well. Rugged housing with rubber protection, compatible with Neutrik's mounting, and it uses Audinate's Broadway chip. So now we're stepping up in the chipset power and cost, and we're also stepping up in the functionality. So let's take a look at that Broadway chip. 0.25 millisecond minimum latency, so a quarter of the latency of the Ultimo chip. You can route inputs and outputs on the same device. And the enhanced feature set of this includes the ability to incorporate these two Ethernet ports, these two Dante ports here, which we'll see is quite a powerful feature. All right, let's talk about the analog and digital audio options. The inputs can be any of the following. Line level analog, same as that first device we looked at, the D-line box. Microphone level with variable gain, switchable pad, switchable fan and power, all controllable, which we'll look at, or AES EBU, 2-channel digital audio. The outputs can be analog with variable digital output attenuation, or AES EBU. Again, we'll take a look at this. So the great feature of this device is this, or one of the great features, I think my favorite feature, is we've got these cool switchable XLR contacts. This is new to the industry, which will detect and reconfigure the device based upon what you have plugged into the device. So let's take a look at this. If I plug a cable into input 1 and I plug a cable into output 1, well, the device knows that this is an analog system, that it's going to be routing analog audio. And same situation here. If I plug in 1 and 2, for the input, 1 and 2 for the output, that is going to be an analog system. But if I plug in only channel 2, in that case, the device will auto switch to AES EBU. And this is the case either way. So this can be analog, this can be AES EBU, this can be analog, this can be AES EBU. The switching function of the XLRs helps us understand if is there something plugged in there. If there's not, then if there's something plugged into channel 2, that's going to be an AES EBU input or output. So here's another example. I've got 2 inputs coming in here. So because I've connected channel 1, this input is going to be analog. But because I've only connected channel 2 here, that output is going to be AES EBU. So that's a really neat feature for people who have both analog and digital connections on their devices. You can use either one here. You can mix and match as necessary. And here's really the other configuration, right? So here you've got 2 outputs, so that's going to be analog outputs. But the input is only connected to channel 2, so that input must be an AES EBU input. And again, this is a 2-in, 2-out device, so it can be 2 channels analog or 2 channels AES EBU. 2 channels of AES EBU only require 1 connection, right? Because that's a 2 channel or stereo signal, which is carried over that 1 XLR connector. Okay, let's take a look at these cool front panel LEDs. So for each of these devices, each of the inputs, I've got signal, and that's going to be red, yellow, or green, depending upon the signal level. 48 volt, which is, is there phantom power or not? And a high pass filter / LED, sorry, high pass filter / pad LED as well. So I've got that for channel 1, and I've got the same thing for channel 2. On the outputs, I've got an LED to let me know if I've muted the outputs. And I've got all these great system LEDs here. Is the system ready? What is the input type? Is it analog or is it AES? And you can see that color coding is presented there. What is the output? Is it analog or is it AES? So some pretty cool features there. And then some more status, some more status lights on the back as well. We've got those link and active LEDs, same as we had on the D line. For both of the ports, excuse me, sorry about that. And we're going to take a look at the use of these ports here in a moment. Let me just take a little drink of water here. Okay, so how do we control all of this? We're going to need to have software control to make this happen. So Neutrik offers D-Pro Controller, which is software for PC and Mac that will sit on the same computer that you can use for your Dante controller in order to route everything together. There's also third-party remote control for mixing desks. You can directly control these from mixing desks. There's a QSys plugin for people using the QSys environment from QSE, and there is AES 70 compliance. AES 70 is a control protocol. So let's take a good look at this D-Pro controller software. This is developed by Neutrik, and let's just kind of walk through what it will do. First of all, you can remember have multiple devices on a network, so you will select your device, and then when you've selected it, you'll take a look at your input channels, and let's take a look here. You can choose mic or line. You can activate 48 volts for any mic input. Obviously, you cannot for line input, right? So we've got 48 volts for mic inputs. We've got pads for line inputs. You've got an 80 hertz high pass filter, and you've got variable gain on the mic inputs. You can also link and unlink channels. And let's take a look at the output channels. So the output channels you can mute, you can link, and again, you've got variable attenuation available here. And you can see with the outputs, same with the inputs, if I plug into only that channel 2, then channel 1 is going to gray out, channel 2 is going to become a stereo bar rather than a mono bar, and it's going to show me those AES EBU inputs or outputs. So same thing happening here on outputs will happen on inputs as well. And here's kind of a sense for how that meter bar is going to show you levels. And these are the same levels which are shown with the red, yellow, green LEDs on the front of the box. You can create presets, which is pretty cool. So you can set these different modes, create presets, save presets, and restore presets as well. Here's an example of loading a preset. So a very, very powerful way to use these devices. Of course, there's a reset for the device. You can reset here as well using the reset button, but you can reset in software. There's a menu that shows you what's going on with the device. Okay, what's the device name, what's the IP address, etc. And there's a network setting window, which is quite powerful as well because it can help you determine if you want automatic or manual IP address setting, static IP address, rebooting, etc. Lots of different things you can do in this network setting. So powerful software control for this device. And here's just a window showing the QSys designer software, which can also be used to control these devices. So powerful device, lots of control available for them. So let's compare these specifications a little bit if we can. So this is the D Pro, the higher performing device. Up to 96K, latency is a minimum of 0.25 milliseconds, as we talked about. That's a limitation of that Broadway chip. Power consumption, we'll say 6 watts. Input and output levels, both 22 dBu. Crosstalk less than minus 100 for both the inputs and the outputs. And the output impedance of 400 ohm. That's the D Pro. Let's take a look at the D line. The D line has that 1 millisecond latency that we talked about, also up to 96K. Much lower power consumption, right? Because it's just a line level device. It doesn't need those preamps. The input level is the same at 22 dBu max, but the output level is lower at 16 dBu. We think this is appropriate for the type of applications that we'll see here. Lower crosstalk specifications, but for the typical applications, we think that these should be fine in this case. And this is a really terrible slide. This slide, sorry about this, compares the two. So we can see, for example, the power consumption for the D Pro versus the D line. Again, these differences we talked about, the output level, 22 dB for the D Pro versus 16 dB for the D line, et cetera. Okay. And again, a lot of this has to do with these differences between the Ultimo chip and the Broadway chip as provided by Audinate, including the network speed as well.
Fred,
okay.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
One of the questions is, can it be used as an analog input with an AES backup if the analog signal is lost and vice versa? And if so, is auto switching?
This is a great question. The device is not auto switching in that regard. When you plug in an analog, but once you plug into channel 1, you're in analog world, period. And you need to have your analog connector unplugged. In other words, channel 1 needs to be unplugged to use AES CBU. And on top of that, it is not an instantaneous switch. There's a bit of an internal reboot that happens to convert from that analog world to that AES EBU world, and that can take a number of seconds. It's well under a minute, but it's a number of seconds. So great question, but no, don't think that I can, use this device to easily back up from one to the other. Great question, but the answer is no.
Thomas, did we answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, very good. Not the answer you wanted to hear, but an answer nonetheless. All right, so let's talk about PoE. We had a question about PoE and PoE plus and plus plus, and I'm going to really go on this topic, and I think you're going to get some information here, which is going to be helpful generally as you're using PoE, especially in these real-time audio-video networks, as Dante is. So the concept of PoE is familiar. We've had it for a long time with telephones, right? It's just that you put that DC power down the same line as the data line. Ethernet power works the same way, and you've really got a couple different ways to do it. You can have a switch with PoE, which is what we see here, and you can have a PoE injector, which is what we see here. So this switch has got PoE built right in those ports. If you're using a switch that does not have PoE, well, you can use an injector, which you plug in the wall or somehow plug into AC power, and then the PoE injector will inject that PoE in here. One important note is that you can use either shielded or unshielded cabling. It does not matter. PoE will work fine with each one. So let's talk about some definitions for PoE. Well, PoE is power over Ethernet. In this world, there are a lot of different acronyms which are really, they could be much more helpful than they are, but it'll be good to know. The PD is the term for the power device. That's the device that's receiving the power. The PSE is the power sourcing equipment. It is the thing which is providing the power. PSE, it's a clumsy phrase, but we're kind of stuck with it. So an example of a PSE is a PoE switch, right? Because that's providing power. And a PoE injector like this one here, and then here's the Neutrik one as well. Neutrik's Dante adapters require PoE. We've talked about this because there's not a DC power supply here. So it makes it really easy. You simply use a PoE switch and that's going to power up that device. Or if you use a switch with no PoE, you can use a PoE injector. And we'll be talking about the advantages for using Neutrik's injector in that context. So here are examples. Again, here's a PoE switch, and here are a couple different PoE power adapters. Confirm that your device is an IEEE 802.3 compliant device. Very important. Okay, so let's talk about these different types of PoE devices. There's what's called PoE with a class designation, class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4, etc. The way that these PoE devices work is that they have a discovery process. So little bursts of electricity are sent back and forth in a power negotiation process, and then the PSC will provide the appropriate power accordingly after that process is done. What's called a no-class PoE device or passive PSE device acts like a classic power supply, just as providing power all the time. There is no power negotiation there. In that negotiation process, as we talked about, there's a connection from the power sourcing equipment to the power device, a short voltage input. The PSC reads that return value, provides power accordingly. That is the handshake process. Now, with a no-class device, there is no discovery process whatsoever. There's no negotiation. The PSC is always sending current, sort of like a classic power supply that you're familiar with. And so this distinction between a power supply with class and a power supply without class is quite important. And we'll see how this comes into play with the NPS-30W Neutrik device that we'll be talking about. So let's talk about these classes. 802.3AF is classes 0 to 3. AT is, I believe AT is plus. It might be plus plus. I apologize for that. And BT, which is a newer standard, all these different classes provide different levels of power. So the term class refers to the maximum available power output. The maximum voltage for all these classes is 57 volts. You can see where class 1 is going to barely make it for that NA2-IO-D line, but it's not enough for the D Pro. The D Pro requires class 4 or above because that's pulling 6 watts. Be cautious. Not all PoE injectors are IEEE 802.3 compliant. And if they're not compliant, they may not operate at sufficient voltage. An example of that, I don't mean to pick on anybody. Ubiquity Networks makes some great devices, but some of their PoE injectors are not IEEE 802.3 PoE injectors. And almost every time that I get a call that, well, I'm using an injector, but the device is not powering up, it's almost always the case that it's a Ubiquity Networks device, which is not IEEE 802.3 compliant. So something to be aware of. Okay, let's talk about Dante's 2 operational modes. These are defined by Audinate. They're set in the Dante controller. One is called redundant mode, and this is where you've got 2 switches. One is for a primary network. The other is for the redundant network, or really for a failover network, right? And then there's what they call switched mode, which I think the rest of us would call daisy chaining. So you can go from one device to another to another. And these are, of course, relevant to the D Pro device with its 2 EtherCon connectors. It is not relevant to the D line, which only has 1 EtherCon connector. But let's take a look at some of these. So redundant mode, which again, remember, has a couple different switches. You can have one switch with a PoE injector if necessary going into one port, and another switch with a PoE injector if necessary going to the other port. That's a redundant mode. So one network switch, a second network switch for redundancy. And switched mode, which is sort of like daisy chaining. This is a very complicated diagram. I apologize for that. But you're going sort of, into, well, let's start at where should we start here? I guess we can start here. Here's one device that goes into another device, that goes into another device, that goes into another device, etc. And you can see that power can be supplied through those devices, one into the other, into the other. So if your primary device is set in redundant mode, you've got a primary switch and a secondary switch. Remember that these switches, if they have class, which they probably do, PoE injectors with class, have that handshake that has to happen when one provides power or the other one provides power. And that handshake can cause an audio interruption. That's not a real redundant network, right? Because you can have that little audio glitching of an interruption as that power negotiation is made by a PoE device with class. By contrast, if you use a device that does not have class, there's no power negotiation. The power is always on. And so you're not going to have that potential glitching that comes from failover from one switch to another. This is why Neutrik's NPS-30W power supplies are no class devices. They are designed for live usage as well as for rugged usage. They're designed to be able to provide power in a failover situation or redundancy situation where there's no audio glitching. So that's a lot to talk about regarding PoE in order to get to why we specifically made devices which are without class. So to answer that first question, are these PoE Plus or PoE Plus Plus devices? No, these are devices without class.
Hey, Fred, I have another
Yes.
question for you.
Yep.
I have a question that says, in a redundant systems, any issues if both ports are powered by PoE switches?
No problem that way. Good question.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you.
Good questions. All right, so now let's take a look at this device of ours now that I've spent so much time talking about the specifics of PoE. So it's the world's first PoE injector that's made for harsh stage conditions. It's got a 30-watt power budget. It's got 1 gigabit speed, which is appropriate for pretty much all audio networks that are out there. Again, it's a passive PoE injector, also called a no-class PoE injector or no-class PSE. Lockable network connection, so right, lockable Ethercon, lockable audio, PowerCon True 1 connector here. Convenient for use not just with the Neutrik devices, but anything that requires PoE that's in a live environment like that way. And because of its 30-watt power supply, it's great to daisy chain, for example, 4 different dPros. And so you can imagine a situation where you're doing surround sound audience ambient miking, right? You can use one of these and you can run from one device into another in order to set those 8 microphones in various places in the location. Okay, front of the device, pretty simple. This is the Ethercon that's got the data plus power, and the rear's got the data only coming in, and the PowerCon True 1 connector here. And again, as I talked about, there's a little LED to show you power on both the front and back sides. PoE was originally intended for fixed installations, right, for non-harsh usages, but now it's being used on stage. So these kind of PoE injectors, no offense to any of them, but these are not designed to be used on a stage in a rugged environment. None of them are built for stage use. It's pretty obvious. So now you can see why our preference is for you to use these NPS-30W no-class devices connected to your switches for the primary network and the secondary network in redundant mode. Because again, when there's failover, there will be no audio glitching. There's no negotiation with the power supply. And in switched mode, again, same situation. That NPS-30W can supply power to the first device. That power will go through the second device, power to the third device, etc. So nice accessory to use. And there was nothing like this on the market, which is why we've made it. Okay, let's talk about cabling. Don't use Ethernet cross cables. Use just standard Ethernet cables. For loads of 20 watts or higher, use AWG24 or higher. For cable lengths of 50 meters or longer, use AWG24 or higher. We recommend foil unshielded twisted pair cables, but there are lots of different good ways to go here. Always use Cat5e cable or higher to be on the safe side. Not necessary, but to be on the safe side. Let's talk about these pin assignments. So there can be different pin assignments from different suppliers. Just know that all these Neutrik devices we've been talking about accept all these different pin assignments. It's okay. Don't worry about with the Neutrik devices. They're protected. They'll shut down. Okay. Finally, let's take a look at let's take a look at the packaging options for this. So we sell the device alone. NPS, that's a Neutrik power supply, 30 watts, right? Dash without cable. Okay, that makes sense. But because it uses a PowerCon True 1 cable, We also have packaging options for different cable types. So here's the NEMA type that we use in the US, some Schuko and some other types. In the US, we stock this one, the one without the cable, and we stock the NEMA one with the NEMA cable. We don't bother stocking these other ones for other locations. And you can see that cable that's here in the packaging. Here's some specifications, sensible, nothing that you wouldn't expect here. Okay, so to summarize this, heavy duty, used with any network device that requires a PoE, lockable connections, passive PSE, no handshake, therefore no glitching, compatible with all the Neutrik mounting accessories, perfect for use with the NA2-IO-D Pro in its redundant and switched modes. Okay, now let's move on and talk about mounting these things. And remember, this is one of those unique selling propositions that I really liked about these boxes. They are there's lots of different ways to use them, to mount them. We've got mounting brackets, so you can put these on a table, podium, floor box, etc. We've got a rack panel to put one or two devices into a rack with some connectors here that are perfect for feed-throughs or anything else you might want to use. And we've got this truss mounting. So let's take a look at each one of these independently. Here is the table mount kit. I think we probably sell more of these than any other of the accessories. It's great. I mean, this device is so convertible. You pull off the rubber cover, you screw these things into the side, and then you can mount the bracket. So here are the assembly instructions, pretty easy. You take off the removable rubber cover. All these devices ship with a rubber cover. Put in your washer, put in your screws, you're good to go. The truss mount kit allows you to put two devices on a truss very easily. And so you see lots of screws, right? Lots to work with here. And again, nice assembly instructions. Pull off that rubber cover, put these yokes on, good to go. So you could put one of these devices on a truss or two devices on a truss either way, using the NA-truss mount kit, Neutrik adapter-truss mount kit. Makes sense. And then we have this rack panel, which again, you can mount a device on the front side or on the rear side, either way. And then you've got these 4 feed-through connectors here, which you can use as you want, these 4 D-size cutouts. By the way, because, ABC, always be closing, always be selling. If you're not familiar with this little device here, in DBA-BL, that's a nice little plastic piece to cover up any D-size holes in your rack frame. Not very expensive. Nice little device to know about. And of course, you can purchase the rubber cover as a replacement. So again, it comes on the devices, but you can purchase it separately as well. So to sum up, what applications are you going to use these for? Well, they're great for stage applications, running out of channels, needing to deploy a Dante network out to a remote speaker, something like this. Great for ambience miking. We've talked about this idea that you can truss mount these things and you can distribute them, and you can use NPS-30W to provide lots of power to 4 different devices. Great for permanent installations, for podiums, for lecterns with that table mount kit, for meeting rooms. House of worship, of course, we always talk about this market where it's very easy to reconfigure if you have an overflow room or you're doing remote services, you're doing drive-in services, et cetera. You need to set up some speakers or some microphones or somewhere in an unusual place. Very easy to do using a Dante network and using boxes like these. The outdoor broadcast truck market is historically a big one for Neutrik. It's pretty dormant at the moment, but it will certainly come back. There's a lot of AES CBU in the outdoor broadcasting truck market, and the D Pro is good for that. And in the corporate and educational worlds, temporary audio routing, being able to send audio through a network for special events, conferences, corporate presentations, et cetera. These devices we think are ideal for that. And of course, the most important of all, applications, et cetera. So that's really what I've got here. Thank you very much. The questions that have come have been great. Are there other questions or anything else I can answer for you?
So if anyone wants to jump in here and ask a question, you can just unmute yourself or you can text it to me, either way. And I will give you guys a minute to maybe jump in here, but just to let you know, we will be following up this webinar with a survey. So if you get the survey, we do appreciate you completing that information for us. And again, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand or jump in here with any questions, text me. You did so good, Fred, that everybody answered all of their questions.
Everyone is either very well satisfied or soundly asleep. And
Well,
I don't want to know the answer. I don't want to know that ratio.
I
Anyway,
think
it's great to talk to everybody. And I know that even though I don't know who's on this call, I'm sure that I know many of you. For those of you who I don't know, it's great to make your acquaintance. And Neutrik is your lifelong partner in this whole AV journey. So if we haven't met yet, we probably will when trade shows resume and we all get back to normal one day.
I got a very nice thumbs up from someone in the audience. I do want to remind you, if you are interested in any of these products, you should call your Herman sales rep. They will be glad to help you with this, and they're available to you at any time. All right, Fred, I think that's a wrap. So we appreciate you attending Herman's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.